everyone, this is Miss Huval. This video is for English 2 Honors. It covers Chapter 3 of Night. So let's jump on in. In order to make sense of what I'm about to say, you will already need to have read Chapter 3. This is not a summary. It's more of an analysis and kind of a discussion of the developing themes and characters and motifs. So you need to read before you watch. Chapter 3 is covered in the book Night on pages 29 to 46. And on JPAMS, I have a Word document that has some note-taking guides, which you might find helpful. I have a challenge for you on this chapter, though. As you read, I want you to take a look at this theme number 2, the importance of maintaining human dignity in the face of inhumanity and degrading circumstances. And as you read, I want you to collect a little list of textual evidence that supports the development of that theme. Okay? So I want you to look at 3 areas of the theme in order to show its development. I want you to look at the atrocities that they face. Make yourself a little list of the atrocities that they face along with page numbers so you can refer back to them as I'm going over my video. And also I want you to look at the examples of how they maintain their humanity in the face of those atrocities. So that's the second thing. So the atrocities, how they maintain their human dignity in the face of those atrocities. And then the third thing is, what impact ultimately does that struggle have on their psyche? In other words, how does it affect them? Okay? So there's 3 things I want you to look at as you read. The overall theme is the importance of maintaining human dignity in the face of inhumanity. And then I'm asking you to look at the atrocities, okay? The way they struggle to maintain their dignity, and then what impact does that have on them overall? All right, so go read and then come back. Okay, if you're back, I'm assuming that you have read Chapter 3. And if you've read Chapter 3, then you're really starting to get a feel for the difficulties that Ailey and his father face. So it begins, and we'll talk about setting first, because I think that's a good place to start, so we get that overall picture of where they are and what's happening to them in Chapter 3. They come into Birkenau, and you get a sense that Birkenau is a death camp. There's the fiery pit of doom that Ailey and his dad almost walk into, that they see babies being thrown into. And that place is immediate selection, right? He was separated from his mom there, and they went ahead and divided up those immediately that they want to survive and those immediately that they want to die. Next, they go into a gypsy camp, and in that gypsy camp, they give up their clothes, and they are sorted into groups based on, I guess, who has obvious talents and skills and who's just going to be a laborer. Then they march to Auschwitz. So they go from Birkenau, which is sort of the sorting center and the extermination camp. They go to Auschwitz proper. And in Auschwitz, they stay 3 weeks. And they have this idea that it's the nicest of the places that they have been so far. They have time to rest and kind of recuperate. They stay there for 3 weeks. And then during that time, they're moving people out to different work commandos. The people who are left, including Ailey and his dad, end up in Buna, which is a work camp. Okay? All of them are on the compound of Auschwitz. They're really like Auschwitz 1, Auschwitz 2, Auschwitz 3, if you've heard of that. And those are the 3 names of the camps that are there. So that's the overall setting and the overall time period. About 3.5 weeks is the time period that elapsed in Chapter 3. And those are the locations of where they are. Now, I don't know if you noticed them talking about gypsies a bit. We talked about gypsies before when we discussed the PowerPoint on the background information. They were another group targeted by Nazis for extermination. Gypsies are an ethnic group called Roma, and they were targeted by the Germans because they were believed to be dishonest, prone to crime, these kinds of things. And another guy you met in this chapter was a Pole, and he was also an inmate. There were Polish Jews who were in concentration camps, and there were also just Polish people who were not Jews who were put into these work camps because Poland was invaded and taken over. Okay, so that's where those people are coming from. And you notice that a lot of the people who were in charge of Ailey and his father's work commandos, their blocks where they sleep, their bunk houses, all of these are also inmates called capos a lot of times. And so these are inmates who are also not workers. You know, they're not being employed by the Nazis. They're inmates who have been promoted to these particular jobs. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit too. But that is what's happening. If that seemed like it to you, that is what's happening. All right, so let's start with that theme that I asked you to reflect on. The importance of maintaining humanity in the face of inhuman treatment, that struggle. Okay? So we've got a whole subcategory of that, which would have to do with your family bonds. Okay, so that's one way they show their humanity. And that's one way that the Nazis try to break them apart. But let's save the family bonds part for later. And let's talk about some of the atrocities that they face. Obviously, marching toward the ditch is an element of psychological terror that we probably can't even imagine. So they're marching towards this ditch that is aflame. They see babies thrown in. And at the very last second, Dr. Mengele turns Ailey to the left and he goes to the barracks instead of marching into the ditch. And that is horrifying. Okay? He says he even hesitates a little bit as he's walking off to make sure that his dad ended up going the same way because he wanted to stay with his dad, whatever the cost. Another atrocity they face is the nakedness. He makes the comment there on page 35. He says true equality. So those who had good clothes, those who had bad clothes, old clothes, ragged clothes, everyone was naked. And these are all men now because the women have already been separated, and their nakedness was an equalizer in that way. Now they remain there with no clothes for the whole night, and it's cold. He mentions that several times. The freezing wind, particularly at night, it seems to be beautiful and springy during the day. It's May, but we're talking about significantly higher latitude. If you take a look across at Europe and where they are in Poland, the latitude is not near where we are. It's even above kind of where New York is on the map, latitude-wise. So it's cold. And the nakedness is another atrocity they face. And then we get to the things that we knew happened in concentration camps. Being disinfected on page 36, having their head shaved on page 35, and being told by the angel of death that they'll work or they'll die. They're at Auschwitz, and they will work or they will die. And pointing out the chimney to them, like they needed that to be pointed out again, after they saw that on the first day. So these are some of the atrocities that they faced. I hope maybe you thought of a few of those too as you were going through. But let's talk about also the ways that they cling to that human dignity, the way they show that their human dignity has not been lessened yet. On page 35, one of the things they do immediately when they're left to their own devices, as they start searching for people they know and inquiring, finding friends, comforting each other. There is a rabbi's brother named Yeho, and I'm probably not pronouncing that right, but he's crying and weeping over the injustice and over the shock and horror of the things that are happening. So as long as you're not numb, as long as you're not so hardened to these circumstances that you can cry, you're clinging to that humanity. There's another great example. Let's see. Oh, no. That was an example of something else. I'm sorry. So there are a lot of examples of them, and many of them are related to family bonds, and we'll talk about that soon. The way that Ailey clings to his dad, their relatives, Stein from Antwerp, his whole reason he clings to life, and that he clings to that human dignity, and he shares his bread with everybody, and he's just trying to hang in there, is to hang in there for his family. All right, but what impact does this have on the characters that we're seeing here in chapter 3? The fact that their human dignity is under such assault by these atrocities, and the fact that they're working real hard to be kind to one another and to help one another. What effect does it have on them? What's the impact? What toll does it take? Well, on page 32, we find Ailey unable to sleep. And that was the night that he saw the babies in the ditch, and the first night that they were turned away and didn't have to march into the ditch. Let's see, over and over again on pages 31 and 32. He asks himself, how can this be real? How can this be happening? And the world remains silent. Okay, so it's really shaking his confidence in his fellow humans, that this could be happening, and somehow people know about it and it continues to happen. How could this be happening on such a large scale and no one have stepped in? And that's a big question from the Holocaust that students usually have for me. How do we not know? How do we let this occur for so long? And we'll talk about that as things go on too. And then on page 36, maybe the most sad effect comes through. And that's when Ailey, at the end of that first couple of days, and it's the first night that was the most impactful for him. At the end of those first couple of days, we've got people crying, people devastated, and Ailey says that he's so tired and he's so worried about preserving his own self that he feels like he's in oblivion. He's no longer trying to comfort people. He's no longer worried about who's who and who's where and any of these sorts of things. So that's the impact that this treatment has on them. And that's what we could see in one little chapter. But there's a lot more, and there are a few angles to that I wanted to discuss too. But that's how we look at theme development. And that's an important skill for you to have when you're reading books, whether they're memoirs like what Elie Wiesel has written here, or whether it's a novel like To Kill a Mockingbird, to be able to look at a theme, break it apart, and see how it develops. And so with that theme, that's kind of what we just did. All right, but let's look at how some of these other themes feed in. Okay, first let's talk about the family. Okay, because this is really big here. He makes the comment, very first page of the chapter, 29, that when the women and children are separated, his mother and his 3 sisters go one way, and he and his father go the other way. And he says that it's the last time he ever saw his mother and his baby sister again. Just a little side note, he does see his sister Hilda and his sister Bee again, Beatrice, Bee they call her. They, after the war, ended up together in an orphanage in France. And so he is reunited with those two sisters. But his mom and his younger sister die, and that's the last moment he sees them. And that's a really, really powerful line right there at the beginning. And it's another reminder that in this story, Ailey is taking it through he is taking us through it step by step. But at the same time, he's giving us the perspective that he has, having made it out alive and having made it through. So it's not like he's innocently and naively encountering these things. He is able, from a retrospective standpoint, to also show why they're important, which is a really cool point of view to tell the story from. All right, guys, we're at 15 minutes, so I'm going to stop the video here, and I'm going to continue in a minute with part 2. I think it's easier for me to upload smaller sections. All right, so that's it for part 1, but be sure to look for part 2. Bye, everybody. Hope you're well.